Come back. The Jacob Zuma Foundation is still pushing back against the state capture inquiry's mission to compel the former president to appear next month. The foundation released a statement expressing its discontent about an application for a subpoena that seeks to ensure that the former president is on the witness stand come the 16th of November. It says the application is late and moot, and it adds previous claims that the work of the commission is biased and politically motivated. For an update now, we're joined by legal journalist Karyn Maughan. Karyn, thank you for being with us as always. So there's a lot of back and forth here. It's still not even clear if the former president, Jacob Zuma, will or won't appear in November.
Really, whether Jacob Zuma's lawyers will appear to argue against the application by the inquiry for a subpoena for him to appear in November tomorrow. The indications are not good, Francis, but we know that Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, last time when he had that announcement in the inquiry, saying that he would hear this application with or without Jacob Zuma's lawyers. Whether or not Zuma's lawyers appear, we know that there are already protests, large-scale protests announced by Karyn Maughan, who, of course, is part of the RET forces that are very pro-Jacob Zuma and very supportive of his various, positions in a number of cases, including the corruption case against him. They're saying that they will be at the venue tomorrow to demonstrate against the alleged lack of impartiality and so-called bias of the Deputy Chief Justice. We also know that Jacob Zuma has previously stated in a letter through his lawyers last week that he will seek Zondo's recusal, and that until that application is finalized, neither he or his lawyers will participate in the inquiry in any form. So at this stage, it does not appear that Zuma's lawyers will attempt to argue against that subpoena when it is argued by Paul Pretorius, who is the evidence leader tomorrow.
Sure. So, do you agree, Karyn? This is an interesting case because the former president is suggesting he has valid reasons not to be at the commission, and that the commission itself is invalid. The commission is testing its ability to say if someone is always traveling or is always sick or always preparing for a trial, enough is enough. And surely other witnesses will be watching. This has big implications for how the commission goes forward.
It has huge implications, Francis. And the essential case that was made from the beginning of this inquiry by the Zondo inquiry was simply that because Jacob Zuma was head of state at the time in which many of the accusations and allegations under investigation by the inquiry took place, it was completely appropriate that inquiry would so-called seek his side of the story. Now, we know from the correspondence that the inquiry has said, for example, that the inquiry evidence leaders believe that he has been implicated by 34 witnesses. But as part of the supplementary affidavit that has caused so much ire on the behalf of the Zuma Foundation, the inquiry's news secretary is basically saying that he hasn't responded to any of those notices of implication. He hasn't filed an affidavit with regard to the evidence of Teba Maseko and Fakely Mentor, as he was asked to do by the Deputy Chief Justice. He hasn't responded or provided an affidavit dealing with the so-called areas of interest identified by the inquiry. He has also not responded to two, directions from the Deputy Chief Justice that he provide information in response to evidence on PRASA and ESCOM, the alleged purging of key officials there in 2015 to make way for a so-called Zuma purge or Gupta's purge. So there's a number and of course Jacob Zuma throughout this has said, well, I don't believe I'm implicated. I have a full right not to respond if I don't believe that evidence in fact implicates me. What makes it different, however, is in regards to the information sought on ESCOM and PRASA, it is in fact a criminal offence not to provide the inquiry when information is requested of you. And the inquiry has the ability to put this into the sphere of criminal justice, which they have decided not to do. But of course, if Jacob Zuma chooses, as he may well do, believing that he, on his version, believes this entire inquiry to be illegitimate, if he decides not to honor that subpoena and arrive and pitch up to give evidence, what does the Deputy Chief Justice then do? Does he pull the trigger on a potential arrest of the former president of South Africa for not coming to the inquiry to give evidence. This is a very high stakes game, and it's really a question of who blinks first, because it's essentially a game of legal and political chicken.
It really is. And maybe finally, just tell us how we got here, because the president did appear before. Tell us a bit about that and give us a sense of the timeline, as the commission has repeatedly tried to get him back on the stand.
Well, Jacob Zuma last appeared before the inquiry in July 2019. During that address, he made it very clear that he believed that his political and legal difficulties were all sourced in an apartheid-era plot against him by foreign intelligence agencies. He named a number of ministers that he believed may have been implicated in that, many of whom have have successfully or attempting to sue him. When he was asked questions, for example, with regard to his relationship to ANN7, he became increasingly frustrated, asked that he be given some sort of guidelines with regard to areas of interest that the inquiry wanted him to address, and the matter was then postponed. He was called back to appear and then said that, in fact, he was unwell and receiving medical treatment overseas. The inquiry persisted with the application, and there was an agreement that Jacob Zuma's medical advisor or doctor would meet with Zondo to advise him of his medical condition. That did not happen, and that appears to be the basis of a lot of the Zuma Foundation and certainly Zuma's lawyers' unhappiness with Zondo, was that they essentially suggested that he believed Zuma was lying about his medical condition, and that he had taken a perspective that Zuma was refusing to cooperate with the inquiry when he had done no such thing. So, that is really where we are at the moment. We know that this has been a long time coming. The inquiry is meant to wrap up its investigations in December, and its report is due on the 31st of March. So by all accounts, if and when this recusal application happens, if there's a legal challenge to the subpoena, I think the lines are very clear at this point, Francis, that it is highly unlikely that former President Jacob Zuma will be appearing at this commission again, and it's very, very unlikely that he will answer the questions being put to him.
Yeah, and then finally, we can only speculate. I mean, say he doesn't appear, and then the final report comes out and says the former president is guilty of the following, or seems to have been involved in the following, then he may bring another legal case saying I didn't give my side of the story. So that's another quandary for the commission, surely.
Well, I mean, this allegation of bias and lack of impartiality is one that clearly Jacob Zuma has maintained since almost the beginning of the process. He's also just raised questions about the constitutionality of the inquiry, because he obviously wasn't given the right to choose the judge that would lead it. That's been an ongoing issue. But remember, of course, that an inquiry is not, a criminal justice process. So if Jacob Zuma chooses to, if the inquiry makes adverse findings against him and suggests possible prosecution, Jacob Zuma may attempt to challenge that, but it certainly won't, effectively circumvent any ongoing criminal investigation that he may be subjected to. The real question will be if people, we've seen a lot of unhappiness throughout this by people who have been implicated about the fairness of the process. What do they then do in terms of the evidence led? Will there be a whole-scale challenge to the evidence uncovered by this inquiry? I mean, none of these legal challenges seem at this point to be legally feasible, because ultimately, Francis, the NPA is going to investigate its own cases outside of the parameters of the inquiry. They may utilize evidence provided, but they will certainly do their own work to make sure that evidence is admissible.
All right, high stakes, like she says, a very interesting legal ground here. She'll follow for us. That was legal journalist Karyn Maughan.